we don't need to use this.
Yeah, we better not use
But
it.
We're not going to use
it
this.
exists.
Sebastian does like to pull cold opens from this little section, though.
I do pull cold opens, but I don't. If you would have watched last week, you would have noticed, Evan, I didn't do anything from the cold open where you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our News from the Real World podcast, where every week we discuss the top 10 comment-generating posts on the blog. My name is Parker. I'm a second-year stage and production management grad student.
My name is Grace. I'm a first-year costume design grad student.
My name is Elliot, and I'm a second-year grad student studying technical direction.
My name is Evan, and I'm a first-year grad studying scenic design. And I have the first article this week, which is called The Responsibility of Creativity. This article tries to discuss what the responsibility is that an artist has to the world around them or divorced from the world around them. It starts off talking about a 1981 Hungarian film called Mephisto, which I have never heard of, which is about an artist, an actor, I believe, living in pre-World War II Germany with the rise of fascism. And over the course of the film, he has to make this choice over and over again, whether his duty is to the people he loves and the people in his life, or to his art, and to be able to continue to make his art. And he keeps choosing his art. And the author of this article suggests that imposes this artificial separation, that you can remove the art from your life. And the author suggests that the opposite is true, that artists in some ways are more in tune with and more sort of the canaries in the coal mine for what's happening in the world, in politics and society. There's a quote that they highlighted, which I'm also going to highlight, from the author John Gardner, an American author, who says, "I think the difference right now between good art and bad art is that good artists are the people who are, in one way or another, creating out of a deep and honest concern, a vision of life worth protecting." And then the author closes out this article indicating that various fascist dictators have recognized the importance of both quashing the old art and instilling new art. And then in bold text at the bottom of the article, it just says "vote" with an exclamation mark. So I think the point is clear. Oh, I've got a cat. What did you all think of this?
Well, I think in terms of separating art from your life, right? I just don't see that as like a possibility for a lot of artists. I don't know. Just, but I don't know. Maybe that poses another question about how maybe we should. I don't know. And I think as theater artists, we tend to not have a lot of separation. So I thought it was interesting bringing up this film, and how can art also be used against other people. And I was thinking a lot about like propaganda and things like that. So yeah,
I think in some small ways storytelling is always political, because you're always expressing a worldview, right?
Yeah,
I think I certainly agree. And again, continuing that idea of separating like art and like the person, especially with everything going on right now, I feel like it is so clear the ties between like people and art, because I know so many people relied on it to get them through whatever it was. So I would like tend to agree that it's you really can't separate the two from each other. And then kind of continuing that conversation towards the end, like it's absolutely like I think we almost undervalue the influence that it has on our lives. I think we almost discard it as like a given and don't particularly internalize how much it affects our decision making. I mean, even so, like there's the obvious of political cartoons and satire, and like SNL is just revamped, which does their own thing, but even more subtly, You're right. You're always expressing a worldview, and that's always going to inherently be like pushing some sort of perspective through whatever medium it is you're presenting your art through. So
I always find myself joking about Anything Goes is my go-to show that like doesn't have a lot on its mind. But I mean, Anything Goes has something to say about celebrity culture. It has something to say about thinking that Asian stereotypes are funny. It has something to say, you know, whether intentionally or not. I think people try to put it up as a show that's about tap dancing, but you're always saying something.
Everything's a product of its time, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But in theater, we revive things sometimes without thinking about how that time works in the modern era, you know?
Yeah, but I think that a lot of things are cyclical, you know, like even though they may not be like literally the same, a lot of ideas, you know, kind of we cycle through. And I think you can say that about like pop culture too, right? Like it's
Definitely.
all kind of just going around in a circle, just taking different forms.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of revivals is also really interesting when thinking about, you know, again, talking about the themes, like it's going back to Anything Goes, like that show is done over and over and over again, but was written decades ago. And there are themes in there that, again, were perfectly accepted in the time and very much not okay at any point in time. Not that they are now socially acceptable, they never were.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it offers us a chance to connect, like, again, a common thread of humanity and a common thread of how people can feel the same 50, 60, 70 years ago and now, and how you empathize with that work. I think there's also like a sense of like, there's like purposeful and accidental like things that get put into our work. And I remember in one of my art history classes way back when, we talked about how everything on the page had a purpose. Like the artist never incidentally put something in their artwork, or they never, you know, were lazy about their artwork. Everything had a reason. And that reason may have been very purposeful, or it may have been informed subconsciously, but there was always a reason behind something, which is an interest. Again, kind of going back, you can really not separate art from the person.
Mm-hmm. I believe that. Well, that's a good segue to our next article. You're ready for that, which is titled "People Are Theater's Biggest Asset. It's Time to Start Valuing Them." So this is an article about the state of theater in the UK right now. The author of this article makes the case that if entire industries need to close due to a pandemic, those industries need specific governmental support, which is I think not an uncommon sentiment for us right now in America either. But she makes this jump and says when that support is doled out, it's often doled out to quote unquote viable businesses, and a lot of theater businesses are not viable businesses on paper, are not financially successful, do not look like they're about to make a lot of money. And the case that she's making is that judging theaters as a business, judging theaters economically, isn't the best way to judge theater. There's a quote in this one that I'm going to highlight as well, straight from the article. She writes, "People who work in theater create a huge amount of value in working overtime and taking jobs whose pay is just a token gesture towards the effort and emotional investment involved in directly subsiding and paying for things to happen." She also makes this leap that theater management, like boards and so on, also undervalue that labor, and that there's this contradiction between bringing people in and making part of a community and asking them to help you subsidize your dreams and your as a company, and then kicking them to the curb, which a lot of theaters with staff have been forced to do. I think this is complicated. I think it's hard in a really capitalist society to get away from looking at theaters as businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, you know, they say that Broadway is like one of the most riskiest investments that you can make. And does almost not make sense. It is almost so counterintuitive and so reliant on donations and people giving out of goodwill of their hearts, and not because the business model itself is bringing in enough revenue to subsidize its expenses. But it's, again, there are certain things that you just can't put, it does not work in that world. There's obviously a lot of conversation about the post office and how, like, the US Postal Service it's not a business, it's a service that is necessary in this country. It's necessary for society to operate, because if you look at it like a business, even though it actually is a pretty good business model, if you look at it like a business and you treat it like a business, you're going to marginalize people that are remote, that do not have easy access to large cities and towns. There's like conversations and there are stories about people not getting medication because the US Postal Service is the one that delivers it to them. And you kind of take that thread and apply it to the world of theater. It's, again, theater may not be that lucrative business model, that one would think about in the world that we live in now, but you almost can't think about it that way. It is a service that is necessary to provide to people, to be able to have experiences, to be able to connect with what they're seeing on stage, with the people that are on stage, and what's the shared experience of being an audience member, as well as just the people that are in the industry itself, to provide for people that want to give to the country, to want to explain and educate other people. Again, public education isn't really a business, it's a service. And I think we have to shift away from the business model of things and look at it more that way.
I think you've hit an interesting metaphor with the post office, because like the post office, most people do not need or utilize the theater. And maybe in both cases, they're making the case for it being a public service, I think is going to fall on deaf ears for some people.
Yeah, and I think what Elliot mentioned about Broadway, and a few weeks back we talked about Broadway being shut down, and now it's being shut down through like May or something of 2021. But how the statistics said that Broadway was bringing in more revenue than like all of the sports teams combined in New York State, which is, a great way to like monetize, like put a number on Broadway and theater. But I think something that I think the people that are hurting the most are especially like those nonprofits, right? And I think maybe that's where it gets really complicated, because when I see theaters as nonprofits, especially regional theaters and smaller theaters, I do see them as more of like, in a way, kind of like a public service, right? Like, they get a lot of funding through from the government. They get a lot of their, they tend to do, they do more outreach than like Broadway is going to do, right? Like, at least in my experience, you have programs that go to schools and they'll teach the stories, the scripts, and things like that. So yeah, it is really complicated when we have such a commercialized idea of what theater is, and perhaps maybe how it's hard to justify it as a necessity, while we also kind of forget the services that a lot of these like smaller local regional companies are doing, these non-for-profit theaters are doing for a lot of young people in their communities, the way that, like, school is a public service. So how is theater not in that sense?
The article makes me think about the people that are missed in that outreach. We're talking about the companies getting the payback, right? The companies are getting funded, the companies to make more jobs, right? But there's only so many jobs, especially right now in the pandemic. There's still all of those people with no work. And how do we support those people, with the article's argument of people are theater's biggest asset, which I believe is completely true.
Well, and sort of as a microcosm of the larger U.S. society, even though it's a very moneyed sector, most employees in the theater sector do not make a lot of money.
Also true.
Yeah, very, very true. I, along with many of my coworkers, was laid off from a company this summer. And it was really sad because we did like a Zoom check-in, and one of my coworkers who had been working there for like 7 or 8 years, which is a long time to work at a theater company, I feel like. She got a job at the bagel shop up the street from the company, and she's like, I get paid more at the bagel shop and I get better benefits. And
that hurt.
so, yeah. So if this doesn't work out, I'm going to Target.
On that exciting note.
Oh, yeah. To segue into our next article, which is titled Anita Hill on Sexual Harassment in Hollywood and Beyond, which is an interview that was written out into an article by Mary Louise Kelly and Maureen Powell. So, like I mentioned, it was an interview with Anita Hill on sexual harassment in Hollywood, and they addressed sort of the Me Too movement, how that has allowed a lot of people to feel comfortable stepping forward about their experiences with sexual harassment and assault. But also, there was a statistic saying that they did survey a lot of people, and so they surveyed 10,000 people, and they found that many would still choose to stay silent because of fear of retaliation, because the people who hurt them are in such powerful positions, which is a very sad, fact to think about. And for context, Anita Hill, in 1991, had sexual assault allegations against Clarence Thomas, who was her boss at the time, but is now a Supreme Court justice. So they do bring up the recent hearings with the now Justice Brett Kavanaugh, which was, I think, probably she probably had a lot of very like similar feelings come up from her own experience. But from the Kavanaugh hearing, Anita Hill felt that the Senate Judiciary Committee really, like, the overall impression is that they just did not take what she had to say seriously, her claims, which obviously I think with the outcome of the hearing, I agree that clearly they didn't listen to her claims as a victim, and they let this man who likes to drink beer become a Supreme Court justice for life. So some more statistics from this article. They said that, so they did this survey on accountability in Hollywood, and they said that 64% of the people surveyed said that they did not think a person who was found to have harassed a subordinate would be held accountable. So I think a lot of this is about accountability, right? And I think on the theme of accountability, especially with this upcoming election, Anita Hill was asked, do you support Joe Biden? And she said, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, but I'm also not the kind of person who, endorses a political candidate, I think was the phrase she used. But she did, a quote from the interview is, "This is an opportunity with Joe Biden, who is involved in the Violence Against Women Act, to really take responsibility for charting a different course." So I think a really great theme for this article is the theme of accountability. And I think we are in this unique situation now. Well, I guess maybe it's not that unique because these themes have been prevalent all throughout time. But I think especially now, and especially with the current situation with the Supreme Court justice nominee and the upcoming election, that like now more than ever, it's really important to know and recognize that all of these decisions that are made are like extremely, like, they're important. Like, they're definitely not things that are just done like casually. So yeah.
I know the article isn't explicitly about the world of theater, but that's the lens that I guess I read things through. it's been interesting over I've worked in Chicago for 3 years, and there's a certain amount that city was trying to find a way to make non-equity theaters not have sexual harassment problems in the wake of a high profile the case of the theater Profiles that got taken down by allegations. But I mean, the story with that theater in Chicago was always everyone sort of knew, and people weren't talking about it publicly until they were. And I could name 3 other theaters in Chicago that were having the same problems afterwards. And I think it is hard to hold people accountable like that for some reason.
I think just as like I think anyone who's ever experienced any kind of hurt or harm from anyone in a position of power knows that. And it can be as small as like personal relationships and things like that, right? Or like small work relationships. But basically, I think, a lot of people who are victims of this are also the victims of like gaslighting, right? And so like that is in a way just psychologically puts people at a disadvantage because they feel like nothing is going, they sort of presuppose that nothing's going to come of speaking out. And so it's just about accountability. It's like, and it's hard because how often do you see people in power who do something wrong like reprimanded for what they do? Hardly ever. And you could say that at almost any level. So I can understand that, we've just created this culture where where there's an imbalance of power. The people who have power have too much power.
Yeah. I think tying it back into the theatrical world, I almost think we almost don't think too often about how many different power dynamics exist in our theatrical structures. I think like our entire organizational model, if you take like the Lort theater model, is just like a massive tree with different people underneath of different people and reporting to different people on the production side of things. And then you have rehearsal rooms where you have different people in different positions of powers with stage managers, choreographers, music directors, with actors who even have their own internal hierarchy of roles. And anytime you have these power dynamics, we need to be cautious and wary of these situations because they can get exacerbated. And there's a rampant problem in the theatrical world, I think, of this. And you see relationships come out of theatrical environments a lot, but I don't think we ever question, I think we need to take a step back and think about how we behave in our organizations, how we behave in rehearsal rooms and production meetings, and, really defining it in. I think we're already starting to get that way with the incorporation of intimacy directors more and more into our world. But obviously, I think there's still more to be done. But I think, again, kind of taking a step back and realizing that like our system is like really hierarchical to the point where like almost everyone has somebody they report to or have people reporting to them.
And this industry has such a heavy history of sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Well, it's that reputation thing, right? I mean, this was the reason that Profiles in Chicago, it took so long for anything to happen because everyone was afraid of being blacklisted as the actor who causes trouble and raises a ruckus and doesn't, because everyone wants to be in good with everybody who could possibly hire them.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I feel like for a long time, theater was like an extremely, well, I think like the entertainment industry is an extremely gendered industry in terms of like you're either a man or a woman, and it's like he was a man, she was a woman. Like what more could you expect, sort of that idea. And I think moving towards perhaps what some people might call a more PC culture, where really just more inclusive culture where we allow people to express their true gender identity, to hold space and have voice in the room as a member of any marginalized group. I think the communication is hopefully going to help with accountability and help break down some of those power structures, those really toxic ones. So yeah.
In the words of Avril Lavigne, he was a boy, she was a girl. Can I make it any more obvious?
Wise words indeed.
Yes.
And especially in the musical theater industry, that binary of the male ensemble and the female ensemble, and then it's the story of, you know, he was a boy, she was a girl. You know, it's
Yeah.
Right.
Even
yeah.
down to dressing rooms, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like you put the women in the women's dressing room and you put the men in the men's dressing room. And at least from like a costume standpoint, at my company, we have this database we use to list all of the costume pieces, and we put all of the actors into this database, and we just keep it forever so that if someone comes back, we have their measurements, we have their information. And what's so crazy to me, because I didn't really think about it until like a couple years ago, but like for so long, we were just assuming the gender identity of all of these people. We immediately saw their name, saw their headshot, and we're like, okay, woman, man. And it was really crazy to me because I was like, wait a second, like how are we, how is that okay that we're just doing that? And I, you know, tried to talk with like the casting director to be like, hey, could we like when we get those internal head sheets, could we, or headshot sheets, could we get the like maybe their pronouns? Because then we decided to start organizing them by the pronouns that they use. And I guess there's a lot of difficulty with just like privacy and stuff where like those are things that they can't ask for on like for during auditions and things like that. So I don't know. I want there to be a better way that, you know, where I don't have to email every single person and maybe put them on the spot in some way and be like, what, you know, what, how do you identify, or things like that. And you know, I get a lot of people, like a lot of people, the company manager would be like, no, we can't ask them those questions, like
Right.
you know, if they want to tell you, they'll tell you. And I'm like, that's fair. But sometimes when you tell, like when I find out this information, it's really late into the process, and can do a lot of harm in terms of like the kind of underwear I'm buying for them, or you know, how just, you know, how I let the team in charge of their costumes and the fitting know their comfortability level. And
Right.
so yeah.
Well, and as somebody that works in costuming, that is so much more apparent because of how intimately you work with performers. And I think we just all need, like, we can all be doing a better job at having these conversations and bringing to the forefront to at least make them more normalized, to that it's okay to talk about these things and have these requests. And again, I think even just like abandoning the barriers altogether and allocating space for everyone to have a private space for their own dressing room, and not just lumping people into a big room and saying, figure it out.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we should also even be assuming that people that are all identifying as male or female or non-binary would be comfortable being in another space with those people. And I think, again, now is a good time to be having these conversations and rethinking while we are planning for the future.
Yeah, it's like instead of putting the lead of the show in their own dressing room, like first of all, it's like, why I get it, like there's like what, like contracts, like the writers and the equity, whatever. But like we were talking about everybody yesterday, and the production that I worked on, the stage management team does the dressing room assignments, which is like kind of weird. I don't know. Sometimes I'm sort of like, why is stage management doing this and not wardrobe?
The teams
or something?
I've worked on, stage management has done the same.
Yeah, it's probably kind of like, it's just the way it's been done. It makes sense. Like they know the actors better, but I think they were just sort of like, we asked them what rooms they wanted to be in and just let them like choose their own rooms. And I was like, okay, like, sure, maybe that's fine when you have like 9 people, but what happens when you have like 30 people in a cast? And like, so yeah, it's very complex and interesting. I think this is yeah, like I think Elliot, like you were saying, it's like as long as you start normalizing it and letting people know that these are spaces they can voice these concerns, we can create at least a more open dialogue.
I think tying that back to our conversation with the article is, again, it really comes down to these power dynamics. And if we can kind of start to remove the feeling that you aren't able to speak up and have that conversation. Because while it's not in the same vein of what Anita Hill was talking about, these conversations are very much important to have and then very similar. And we're changing the subject ever so slightly. But the reality is still the same. So
Yeah, I guess to segue from Hollywood, why don't we talk about the National Endowment for the Arts?
And the article is unfortunately no longer working, so we will wish the National Endowments of the Arts a happy 55th birthday and move forward.
fantastic. So then jumping back into the world of Hollywood, the next article, Will Congress Save Cinema? Hollywood's top filmmakers issue a stark warning. This article centers around financial support, not necessarily for the mainstream movie theaters, but specifically kind of towards the local movie theaters and cinema that are currently struggling significantly from coronavirus. And there's a conversation about government support to these organizations. And there's a kind of a back and forth, and the article kind of hints at, is this a reckoning? Is this something that we are now seeing kind of the demise, if you will, of local movie theaters with the advent of all of these streaming services that exist out here? I think with this bailout, we often think of like 2008 bailouts of the auto industry or the big banks and kind of draw parallels to that, and whether or not a government should be bailing out these movie theaters, or whether or not it should be bailed out internally, as it were, by corporations. On that note, there's almost this hint of, is that a good thing? If all of these corporations are going to be bailing out small movie theaters, is that going to kind of monopolize the small market film industry where they can dictate what is showing? So it's an interesting conversation to have, because again, we're at this pivot point. Where do we see the future of kind of smaller market cinema with all of these streaming services readily available, and if that should be privately solved or whether it should be publicly solved? There's a great comment that has, let me think about this. Victor Gutierrez said on basically at the end of it, which I very much agree with, is they just need government assistance because there's a pandemic. And I think that just kind of gets to the heart of the issue. Is I don't like, we're having this conversation about like Congress saving blah 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 blah. Like they need it because we're living through unprecedented times. We're not talking about kind of like almost a Parks and Rec trying to save the small local movie store. Like this is a pandemic that is hitting every industry, but in particular entertainment, very hard. This isn't really an issue of like, oh, well, is the cinema doing okay?
Right.
So.
It's not a question of how many people are showing up, because people cannot show up is what the problem is. Like
Exactly. And while other industries are able to be kicking off and getting back going, the entertainment industry is one of the furthest away from that.
And I guess like I think we talked about this a little bit last week about like the ineffectiveness of certain kinds of masks. But like I think the CDC like just this week released in like more information saying that like COVID is spread through the air, like through aerosols, right? And so like that information just by itself should be enough to be like, wow, I don't want to be indoors with any group of people that have not been in my bubble, right? And so like and I know that there's like I talk of like advanced HVAC systems, but like I highly doubt that every single place that is letting people indoors is upgrading to an advanced HVAC system.
Well, especially in movie theaters. There are movie theaters open in Pittsburgh now.
Yeah.
For one thing, there's no big movies coming out except for Tenet, which was not a success.
Right.
and the audience isn't there because I think people know, right? And so if the audience isn't there and they're already hurting, they don't have the money to do a very expensive renovation of their air filtration.
Exactly.
I mean, it's the same problem that traditional theaters have, where it's like people and time, you know? It's not going to be safe until there's not a pandemic.
Yeah. The article also goes into note that even some of those movie theaters that are opening up are seeing like just historically low numbers, not because of anything other than people don't want to go out. And the way that they have to do social distancing means they can only have such a small group of people seeing these movies. And I think it gets, again, to that. It kind of almost gets to the heart too, that I don't think people don't want to be seeing movies. Like, people really want to be going back and seeing movies. There's like a drive-in movie theater locally to me that is like doing extraordinarily well because people want those experiences. People want to go see movies. And it kind of gets back to the point of like, this isn't a question of whether or not movie theaters in general are doing well or doing poorly. It's a pandemic.
Yeah,
and
drive-ins are back.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like literally life or death, right? Like,
right.
Yeah,
and
it's like I don't really want to die watching a rerun of Hocus Pocus. As good as
well, it's on like Disney Plus or something. So,
well, and maybe this got covered in an episode of the podcast before I joined, but right at the beginning of the pandemic, when Trolls World Tour came out, did y'all know about this?
I know about Trolls World Tour.
So Trolls World Tour was supposed to have this big cinema release, and it was supposed to release like mid-March. And when all the theaters closed down, they pulled it from theaters and they released it on one of the streaming services for money. And it made like a crazy amount of money because everyone was suddenly home and wanted to watch the new anything, right? And it started this whole feud between, I think it's Universal and AMC, because Universal said, oh, this is great. People are spending all this money doing this. We want to release all our movies this way, in theaters and online at the same time. And AMC said, then we're not going to play your movies. And there was an article at the time that went into the details of it, but there's a lot of ways that movie studios have really been screwing over in-person theaters for a long time now. And this is sort of the latest in that. But the world, the way we watch movies, the world is changing. Not every movie needs to be a big cinema experience.
No. There's actually another ongoing dispute that was an article from this past week on the Green Page about a back and forth between Actors Equity and the Screen Actors Guild,
Right.
about this a very similar conversation, but when it comes to filming live theatrical performances. And it's kind of a mess, and I don't think that anybody has like a really clear-cut answer in terms of solving that, like this like idea of streaming and releasing and like internal squabbles. Not that they're to diminish them, because they're important and people's livelihoods are depending on it. But again, kind of linking back to the article, it really is a pandemic. And I think so far, and you can talk about Broadway as well. We talked earlier about how Broadway brings in so much money to New York, more so than local sports teams do, that we need to be doing more for the entertainment industry. Like, the reality is that this industry is one of the most hard hit of all the industries, that you just fundamentally cannot, anybody that's tried to do Zoom theater and Zoom performances has realized you just cannot achieve the same thing.
Yes.
And the government needs to be doing more, because it's a pandemic, to help these local movie theaters get through so that they can continue to provide their services.
And for a lot of reasons, it seems like the government has a lot going on. Seems like they're busy.
That's a very astute statement.
So well, I don't know. I mean, this is sort of the question, and this maybe can segue into my next article, but which is about government assistance. I'll just read the article and we can talk about it. The article is called "We Need a New Federal Theater Project." So it's I'll just read this quote from the beginning of the article. "We need a new federal theater project as Roosevelt set up during the Great Depression, which provided jobs for the unemployed theater artists and presented live theater across the country at low cost or free to some 25 million Americans, 1/5 of the country at the time." There's the tweet. So this is an article based on this tweet from the same person. So the Federal Theater Project was part of the Works Progress Administration, This article points out that it was only 0.5% of the total Works Progress Administration budget was needed to make the Federal Theater Project work. And they say if you applied that to the current bailout, it would be about $10 billion for theater. So there's some issues here. Like, I don't think anyone's expecting people to be making and producing live theater during the pandemic. But going back to an earlier topic, I think that a lot of other countries have benefited from having, and America has benefited in the past from having government-supported theater. And I think that it creates an environment where theaters feel like they can do fewer productions of Anything Goes, for example, and take more risks, right?
When I spent some time in London, I have a semester abroad in London, and going to the National Theatre was one of the absolute best places to go to, and seeing the potential of something like this here would be, amazing.
I think it would be really exciting to have something like that. And if we don't expect the government to do anything about this in the immediate, or even in, let's say in the next year at least, what can we do as individuals to bring about a more moneyed world for theater, a more financially independent world for theater? I can't work for cheaper.
It brings up the point though, because we were just talking about Broadway, like very highly commercialized theater versus not that anything else that's not making that much money, because the people who are producers and investors in those like big Broadway shows are people who already make and have a lot of money from presumably like Hollywood, right? They're Hollywood producers who are funding like Wicked, the next Wicked or something.
It's also a prestige thing. I mean, rich people see it as like a thing to make them look fancy. In fact, our own president invested in exactly one Broadway show, which was, of course, a huge flop.
So, yeah, I guess it's how do we bring that sort of like hype to smaller theaters? But I guess that's just the problem. It's like at the end of the day, it's like if we're monetizing it, it just becomes about the money. And, I think if you look at like Hollywood and then the overlap with Broadway, it's just like five of like the same names, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just producing all of that stuff. So, I think it's the government assistance, right? But not necessarily the government assistance for like Broadway, but like these local places that employ collectively thousands of people, who are helping stimulate that economy in that area. They need the support. Right. It's like we can't all go work at the bagel shop.
It goes back to the conversation we were having with people our theater's biggest asset about theater. Theater really needs to be thought of often as a service. I think that needs to be provided. It may not have that business model, and that's not to say that you can't have business model theater. It's like we have FedEx and UPS that can do some things better maybe than the Postal Service, and Broadway can make a business out of theater. But the theater world in general, I think we need this. This is a program that we need to provide a service to American citizens in general. It's not about, anything other than this is something that we as a society really need in such a developed country. Art, access to the arts is vital to people's mental health and their well-being, especially now how many people have turned to art and movies and Netflix to get through this time.
I think it just goes to show how little the U.S. government values its people, right? Because, in other, like in like the UK, the citizens are still getting money. Like, I don't know how often, but I mean, since the pandemic started, they've been getting money from the government. Like, how much did we get for the last 7 months? If you got it, $1,200. So, I guess it starts with the people, like, because if you don't show that you care for them and you're not giving them the support they need, how are they going to be able to support other businesses and be as, because they're so worried about how they're going to pay next month's rent that they're not worried about like the local theater that's like donate. We don't want to lay everyone off.
Right.
So
segue to the next article that has nothing to do with theater, but everything to do with our institution. I think this article is actually really awesome. So Carnegie Mellon makes global goals local. And just going into some specifics here, it's all centered around these 17 SDGs. There's a survey down at the bottom about how many people knew these SDGs existed beforehand. And only about 50% of the students on campus knew about these. I was one of the students who had no idea these existed. Essentially, they're global goals which focus on elimination of poverty and hunger, environmental sustainability and climate action, access to clean water, gender equality, quality education, and other areas. So CMU built a AI through Dimensions, I believe, Dimension software, which kind of tracked all of articles released about CMU, CMU's course offerings, the content CMU is putting out, and kind of grouped them into each of these 17 global goals to look at which of them CMU was maybe lacking in, and then did like an analysis towards the end about which ones were stronger and which ones needed a little bit more work. One of the things that I thought was interesting in the in the reduced inequality section, which is SDG 10, a big part of what has changed in the theater department this year kind of fits into this category. You know, we've added this ART, anti-racist theater course, into the curriculum, and they talk about that being something that is counted towards action CMU is taking in this certain category, along with looking at curriculum and picking out the proper classes that fit into this mission of the 17, recognized global goals. I think is a very exciting article and great to see the detailed work. And it's nice that it explains the actual methods of how CMU went through to get this information. And that's pretty much that.
I think it's exciting to be at an institution that is taking some of these things seriously. I think that some schools pay lip service to these ideas, and I hope that articles like this are an indication that Carnegie Mellon is doing more than that.
The article also, I neglected to mention, states CMU is the first to do a detailed analysis of their environmental effects like this.
It's funny the way that you describe the survey, because it makes it sound like it was really very external. Like they asked an outside group to look at it, which makes sense, and then the outside group just examined press coverage of Carnegie Mellon and didn't speak to anybody at the school. There must be some things that the school is doing that hasn't gotten press. And
the school did release a statement, I believe, claiming that this was not a completely what's the word I'm looking for?
Comprehensive, accurate.
Yeah, it's strictly a thing that was done to take a look at some of the information, and they were very aware that the algorithms Dimensions came up with left out some things. And even through reading the article, they mentioned we only got these 4 different areas that came up for this SDG, but we know as faculty of the university that X, Y, and Z also exist. Mm-hmm. Not completely inclusive, but certainly a good step in the right direction.
I certainly have been appreciative of the way that CMU has approached some larger social justice issues in terms of communication.
Yeah, I think something that I really appreciate about CMU is the integration of that into our coursework and into the culture, because, I've had experiences in the past where these things are completely optional. Like you can choose to participate or you can choose to not. And, a lot of pushback you would get is it's not in my job description. And, part of me is like, but as a human being, shouldn't you feel compelled to be a part of these conversations or to just better improve the world you live in? So, I think it's a great thing that a higher education institution is finding ways to integrate these things that do matter to everyone. And especially marginalized communities, into the culture and like everyday life of the university and the coursework.
Particularly like the one note of the article states of one challenge that CMU found was a lack of awareness in general. Because again, this was the first time I had heard. But there was more than half the survey respond, like people that they surveyed wanted more information about this thing.
Oh, right.
And I think that is vitally important. We're in technical direction 3, talking about green theater and doing research products about green theater, partially to see what we can do internally about our own practices, but also in part to be able to have these conversations, to be able to have informed conversations about what we're doing, so that we can engage in these discussions with not only internally in organizations, but externally as well. And I think it's a good sign, going back to what Evan said about hoping that this isn't lip service. It's good to see this is not a CMU article. This is written by Inside Higher Ed. And hopefully this continues to be something that is pushed.
Definitely. Another very interesting article this week, but slightly different topic. A professional dancer with generalized anxiety. I'm a professional dancer with generalized anxiety disorder. Here's why dance companies need to start prioritizing mental health, which I think is awesome. Written by Abby Stafford on September 25th of this year. She goes on to explain her experiences in dance, claiming that this new Zoom world we live in is the best thing that's happened to her dance experience, which was something that kind of threw me at first, but she's finding herself no longer comparing herself to the others in the room, which has been incredibly beneficial. And she goes on, she was a professional dancer with the New York City Ballet, to talk about several moments that happened to her, where specifically one moment where she was having a panic attack backstage, or an anxiety attack backstage, with just overwhelming fear of going on stage for that specific night. And a faculty member came up to her and consoled her, and I don't believe she went on that night, but years later, that same instance was used against her as claiming that she was no longer a reliable person, because of that one specific night, because mental health is not prioritized in this industry at all. This person has since left the dance industry, but it's a very, very important claim. I think it's something that is not often thought about. It's something that relates to the sexual harassment conversation we were having earlier in this podcast. And I think it certainly needs to be paid some attention.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think we put ourselves there's such a societal drive to want to compare ourselves so much with other people, and I think that's ingrained. That's a much broader scope problem, I think, that we need to address in all levels of education. I mean, growing up, it feels like we're always being compared, and that should never be the case. You should always feel as an individual, and I like that the author says that she doesn't have to feel like, or they don't have to feel like they are being compared back and forth. And my hope would be we get to the point where we're celebrated for being able to be able to express what we're doing without the fear of being judged, and feel that we need to compare ourselves, and that we're valued as individuals, not as just a number on a ranked sheet for auditions. And I particularly like the point that there just needs to be more mental health support within dance companies provided at all levels of the organization. It's baffling that that's seen as a way of saying, oh, this person's unreliable if they had this incident several years ago. That's the point of having understudies and swings and people that can be there. I don't think anybody would ever be like, oh, well, this person had a cold one time, they're unreliable. It's a part of many people's lives, and we have safeguards that we already incorporate in our industries, but we have this stigma against mental illness as being something that someone has the ability to somehow control, and is something that is, they should be able to handle themselves. And if they don't handle it themselves, then they're not reliable. And that's just not the reality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As
I think it's important to make sure that we have safeguards, because every now and then I feel like I end up working on a show where I look around at tech and I go, oh, are there not understudies for this show? Like, there are sometimes people don't do that work and say, well, it's a short run and no one will get sick or whatever, you know. And I think that we have to keep pushing to prioritize the health of performers, and the ability of performers to not have to have that show must go on mentality, and to have real backup. I mean, even the Broadway schedule, having to do a show on Broadway 8 shows a week is very taxing. And the fact that people get upset when an actor of some stature, you know, a Mama Rose or whomever, a Dolly Levi, says they aren't going to do matinees or something, that they're going to give that to their understudy, people get upset about it, you know. But like, that is a person who has deserved the right, who deserves the right, as everybody does, to not do 8 shows a week.
Completely.
And I think specifically talking about dance, we had an article a couple weeks ago about introducing like intimacy directors and choreographers in dance, because I think something that is, I don't know, I don't have a lot of experience with dance, but to me, reading an article and kind of hearing about this, there's so many gray areas in terms of how we define boundaries in dance, at least in terms of physical boundaries, health, physical health, mental health. So yeah, I mean, I do feel like, at least reading what I've read about dance versus, you know, maybe theater, is that, you know, at least in theater, we've got some sort of like a system most of the time. Like, you've either got your swings or your understudies. It's like, or like they hire a pregnant woman for the run, and she ends up not being able to do 2 shows a day, right? Like, but there are things but it's okay. Like, it's all okayed and in the contract and everything. So, it's finding, you know, or at least creating some kind of normalized culture that values mental health as much as it does physical health. And I think that could be said for everything: work, school, especially when children are young, in like high school, middle school, just taking those mental health days. And I don't know if you all can relate as much, but at least a lot of my peers, because a lot of classes I do take are art-based, like drawing and design, that a lot of people feel more comfortable. Like, they have less of that pressure of like the teacher looking over your shoulder, or like literally seeing everyone else working like right next to you, and you being like, uh, you know, feeling the need to be better. That's sort of helping alleviate some pressure, right? Or even the fact that, like, I don't know if you all feel the same, but like Mondays don't feel as like bad for me as they used to, because I'm like, oh, I just like wake up and I get to draw a little bit, and then, you know, I'm done. So again, I don't know if you all can relate that specifically, but
As someone with anxiety, I have found certainly that helps, you know, like being online certainly helps in some aspects in terms of like the actual taking of the class, but that anxiety is then shifted to someplace else, you know, keeping up with everything completely virtually and other facets, you know. But I completely hear what you're saying and totally agree. It's also interesting that they said in the article, you know, as dancers, we're at the mercy of our bodies. And I think that is an understood concept in the dance world in terms of, you know, physical ability. And I think it should certainly include mental health. You know, that should be included in the umbrella of, we are at the mercy of our bodies. You know, it's an incredibly hard thing we're asking of these people, you know, to be on stage every night performing at this level.
Being a dancer seems especially rough. I had a friend who wanted to be a dancer well, we've been friends for a long time, but like high school, middle school, you know, we were friends, and up through now. And she wanted to be a dancer when she was young. And then there was a point in high school where she was like, if I really wanted to be a dancer, I would need to not only have the money, but also the time to spend all of my waking non-school hours in the studio, practicing and practicing and practicing. And then I'd be lucky if I made it to 35 before I had to stop dancing and start teaching dance. You know, like it's like the quarterback life, right? Like we run these people until, and then dispose of them. And they have to go do something else with the rest of their life.
yeah. And I think kind of going back to what Parker was saying, I mean, like having anxiety or depression or other mental illnesses. I mean, they're medical conditions, right? It's
Mhm.
like the same as if the doctor's like, you have strep throat, like you cannot go into work. You need to take these antibiotics or something, right? I think that's something that perhaps as a culture we've separated the two a little, but I mean, I think especially in this Zoom setting, and I feel like especially at CMU, I do feel a lot of support from my professors. You know, they're like, we understand if you're having a hard day, you can turn your camera off, like,
Yeah.
or like, you know, and which I think is great in this time, because sometimes when you're on Zoom for like 8 hours a day and it's the last class, you're just like, I just don't know if I can do it, you know. That I appreciate the support from faculty.
Being seen as a different level of stress. One of my roommates goes to UPitt, and they make them keep their cameras on during class, and I'm like, I even though I usually keep my camera on, I'd be frustrated to not have the option.
Right.
I guess speaking of mental health, does anyone else just feel so much better when they go to a theme park?
Of
Yeah.
course.
Oh, the theme park trip that was like the staple of, I don't know if your high schools did this, but like that was like the trip that like
Yeah,
the end
yeah.
of the year, like you'd bus around to, like, I know for us it was Hershey Park, King's Dominion, like, and that was like the best part of the semester, the year, was the school trips out there. I miss them very much, and it's just such a unique, like, when I went into wanted to go into the theater industry, obviously, like, I enjoyed theme parks and I enjoyed all these things, but like I never really considered, like, wait a minute, I could also do that, and that's so cool and that's so much fun, because you get to take your theater making and storytelling to a completely different level. It's just so unique, and yeah, I definitely miss it.
Sorry. Well, yeah, so to segue into the next article, which is just titled Theme Park Storytelling, but I guess the person who wrote it also captioned it 5 Lessons from My Large Scale Study. It's by Carissa Baker. Well, I think to kind of tie in like Elliot's sentiment about theme parks is it is such an interdisciplinary field that is so big that we don't even realize how all of our skills as theater artists can be applied towards theme parks, right? So to summarize the article, so Carissa Baker she's 2 college degrees centered on stories and a PhD on theme park narratives, and which I think is really cool because, you know, who is like, yes, I'm going to get my degree in theme park narratives. So basically, her article kind of just breaks down how she compares theme park narratives and how they've changed and evolved over time, specifically in the USA, Europe, and Asia. So she breaks down like the 5 most or just the 5 things that she learned from her study. And one of those things is that the 2 most pervasive types of attractions are dark rides and stage shows. So in terms of storytelling, it creates a very powerful visual vehicle for storytelling, right? Because it's like theater, like you're seeing someone on a stage performing, and there's lighting and costume and acting. The second thing she learned is that setting is the most commonly used narrative technique. So like themed spaces, right? So whether it's I'm not like a huge theme park person, but like, you know, you've got like Disneyland, it's Disney themed, and then within that you've got different like stories from Disney, whether it's something from Pixar or like just Mickey Mouse or whatever, and or like Wizarding World, right? You're literally being transported into the world of Harry Potter, and that's what guests want. They want to be in like a different space other than like the space they normally live in. The third thing she learned is that the most common use of like theme is intellectual property, which she condenses to IP, just because it eliminates having to provide a lot of exposition. It's like if it's something that we all kind of know, you don't really have to like explain it. So like we all know Harry Potter pretty well, so we're not going to be like, why is it like this here? Why is there a dragon? It's like, oh, it's Harry Potter. Sure, makes sense. And it also like gives people more of an emotional and sentimental attachment to things, depending on their relationship with that. The next thing that she learns is that variety in the way that storytelling is done allows guests to sort of engage for longer without feeling fatigued. So, that could be like, that could be through design, that could be through like a stage show, that could be through like a character wearing a suit or around the corner, taking pictures with kids. So I think she also mentions that like other places like museums and heritage sites will employ these same techniques just to be competitive in terms of engaging their audience for longer. And then the last thing she mentions is all of these attractions mirror the changes that we see in society. So as the industry itself can influence just sort of the evolution of raising the bar for people, because like, and I guess I think of this most concretely with like technology, like how can you improve technology to make it as cool and new and fresh as possible? So I think a lot about like Disney, because I feel like they're constantly changing or adding things. I mean, they're buying like entire franchises and talk about, I mean, they really do have the monopoly, I think, on theme parks, just because they have such a wide range of stories and characters that people care about so much. And then they bought like Star Wars and Marvel. So like talk about like two other massive franchises that have their own followings that they can monetize and just like do whatever they want with in their theme parks. And like, that there are people who are going to Disneyland just for the Star Wars stuff, right? So I thought this was a really awesome article. Like I thought it was so cool that someone like broke it down into how we as people enjoy these, have these experiences. Because sometimes I'm like, I don't even love rides that much, but like, if someone were like, if we weren't, in a pandemic, someone were like, do you want to go to Disneyland tomorrow? I'd be like, hell yeah. Like,
Yeah.
let's go walk around and wait in lines for hours.
Well, and especially as a designer, one of the things that I really appreciate about Disney is that there's a real focus on design, and there's a real focus on one of the things that Disney's famous for in the designs of their parks is all this attention to detail. That there's different style garbage cans in different sections of the park, and different benches. There's less benches now, which is a complaint people have. But and I think that's one of the reasons that Disney has become synonymous with theme and entertainment like that, right? Like, I worked at an amusement park locally in New Hampshire for 2 years, and I still think of Disney first if someone brings up amusement parks, not the one that I worked at. I remember going to Cedar Point, the roller coaster one in Ohio. Cedar Point last year for the first time last summer, not this past summer, the summer before. And when I got there, being like, "But what's the theme? Like, why are these things next to each other? What's going on here?" So I think that Disney set a standard for a lot of people in that way. And as a designer, I love walking around like Epcot and being like, "Oh, you had to get from this country to this country, and you did it really well, right? Like this transition feels really nice."
Yeah, and I think what's so great about amusement parks and theme parks in general is, like I mentioned earlier, like employing so many different kinds of artists, because you need someone to design the layout of the park and come up with a theme and design the attractions and the trash cans, but then you need someone to light those things, and then you need the music that's going to go with it, and then you need like the animatronic thing, or you need the giant suit of whatever character you're wearing. I think a lot, like this made me think of, I have a friend who her dad is like a furniture designer. Like he designs the patio furniture for Disney. And I'm like, that's so random, but like, yeah, somebody totally has to do that. And like, it's so cool to think that like this brings together so many aspects of design. Like it could be like interior design with, I I'm sure like ride design is its own, you know, like you need someone to like storyboard, right? Like the narrative of just a ride in general. And then you need someone to like compose the music for it, or, you know, it's super, it's just making me nostalgic. Like I want to go to to Disneyland right now.
Group
I
trip.
haven't been to an amusement park in so long, but just listening to like reading this article, like it's made me think about the detail and like the different types of attraction and how everybody's laid out. It's like very similar to a production in a lot of ways.
Right. And
It's
something that always hits me about this too, and you want to talk about bringing it back to storytelling, is one of the things that makes like Disney and some of these theme parks so good at what they do is they are masters at storytelling across the board. We have brought up Harry Potter earlier, and there are many people in the Harry Potter world that some people have only ever watched the movies at a cursory glance. Some people have kept up with every last word that J.K. Rowling tweets. And the thing that they have done so well is they provide for everyone. Something I've loved about like certain TV shows is how masterfully some of them can create an individual episode of something that can be great for the general audience viewer or somebody that's watched the series several dozen times and continues to find new things. And I think that's one of the things that you can do really well in a theme park environment, is providing an experience that anyone, from somebody that almost doesn't have any idea what the world that they have built is, all the way to somebody that has been there several dozen times and still gets something new each and every time. Like I remember the first time I went to Disney or Disney World down in Florida. Like I enjoyed Disney, watched Disney movies and watched Disney Channel and stuff, but like I was never really like I never was like really involved at that point in my life in like the Disney universe. But it was still an absolute blast because they did a great job at telling individual stories that didn't really rely on me having previous knowledge. But now you see, and I have several friends that did the Disney College program that still fall in love and find all these amazing new features that they are able to expand upon. Which I really found that point about intellectual property to be quite unique.
Right. And people who make long YouTube videos about Disney rides, and I do happen to watch long videos about Disney rides sometimes, complain about the staying power of IPs, right? Like when you make, as Disney's done recently, retheme a ride to be about Guardians of the Galaxy, what's the shelf life of customer interest in Guardians of the Galaxy, right? Like there are some of those Disney animated movies became classics. So there's like a chicken and egg thing there. Did they become classics because they were good and then the rides kept on being relevant, or did the ride help cement it as part of popular American culture?
Exactly.
And I think something that I just remembered that I think is also just integral to the experience is down to the food that you can get right at theme parks. And I think Disney is probably still number one in terms of that, because they really know how to theme their food to whatever part of the park you're in, and in a very nostalgic way, like the Mickey Mouse shaped beignets that are very popular. But if you haven't seen a lot of it, I highly suggest looking at food from Disneyland Tokyo. They know how to make the food super cute. Like I think you can get little like mochi that's in the shape of those aliens from Toy Story with like their faces on them, and I'm just like, I can't even fathom how that happens.
Okay, when this pandemic's over, we're all going to Disney World.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely down. So all this talk about intellectual property brings us to our last article. Randy Orton's tattoo artist sues Take-Two for using her designs in WWE video games. So this was a really interesting article to read, and even like really interesting to read the comments on the green page about individuals' thoughts about it. But to summarize, so Take-Two is a video game company that it puts out a WWE or World Wrestling Entertainment video game. And there is a character, a wrestler, Randy Orton, who has very distinct tattoos that he got from the tattoo artist Alexander. Where did I lose her? Catherine Alexander. And so Catherine Alexander is suing Take because they recreated her tattoo art for the video game. And this is not unprecedented. So there was an incident of this a few years ago when it came to LeBron James's tattoos in the NBA video game series. And it just brings up a really interesting conversation about intellectual property and what art belongs to which person. And when it comes to tattoos, I think it becomes a very complicated conversation, because I think normally people can associate the artist and their artwork pretty one-to-one, but who does a tattoo really belong to? And who owns the right to that tattoo? Is it the tattoo artist, or is it the person who has that tattoo on their body? And is it okay, for somebody else to own part of what's on your body? Is that something that is a binding agreement between the tattoo artist and the individual who's getting that tattoo? And it just brings up a broader scopes question about like intellectual property in general and intellectual property when it comes to artwork.
I have so many questions about this. I mean, presumably Randy Orton and LeBron James were both compensated for their appearances in these video games, and were contractually, I'm sure that those companies also own the likenesses of both men to some degree. And it's wild to me to think that you could have something as physically part of your body that did not belong to you. Like that, when you say those words in that order, it sounds like some sort of odd sci-fi concept, like you have an implant and they're going to come take it back or whatever, like Reba the Genetic Opera, which I've never seen.
And didn't they mention though, like selling fake tattoo sleeves with those tattoos on it, as to commercialize and profit off of that? So I think that clears it up a little bit.
That's much more clear, because that's making
you got to pay her for that, because he's capitalizing off of his tattoos.
Because she designed the art, but what are the next levels of this? If this went to the Supreme Court and got decided, what would the ramifications be? What about the clothes? Are any of the clothes protected by copyright? What if you got a really specific haircut that was designed by a hairstylist? Would that belong to the barber? Like there's a lot of questions there that this raises.
It certainly does.
I think they should kick her some money, but I think it raises a lot of other problems.
So there's something a completely unrelated field, but something that I thought of when I read this article for the first time. So when I was working for a company over the summer, and we were working with a second, we jobbed out a project to another person to create this electrical control system. And one of the stipulations in the contract that we had with them was, once there was a handoff of that design to our company, we fully owned everything about that object, that device. We paid the person who made it, but we owned everything related to it. We could modify it, we could create it, and we could resell it. And it didn't matter how much money we made off of it, how we branded it. It was our intellectual property, even though we weren't the company that made the thing.
Which I think is common.
And I think that's very common. And I think I don't know, really, I've never had a tattoo. I don't know what the process is in terms of having that relationship with a tattoo artist about where does it lie? Where does the intellectual property lie? And the unfortunate reality of removing kind of the tattoo sleeve for a moment, the unfortunate reality is that, like, I unless it's very clear cut, I don't know if an artist can lay claim to something that's on somebody else's body. And unless that was a very active conversation that was had between Randy Orton and Christine Alexander, it's going to be very muddled in terms of, does that artist have the right to do that? Does that artist have the right to then tell Randy Orton, actually, you know what, you need to get laser tattoo removal because I no longer want my artwork on your body? Is that now where again, talking about ramifications of this decision, is really, are we deciding who owns the artwork? Is it the person whose body it's on, or is it the person who made the artwork to begin with?
Or is it some combination of both?
Exactly.
Right.
And where does that line fall?
That's an interesting framework, though, because I think that I would not expect to live in a world where the artist could tell him he had to get it removed. I think that kind of clears it up for me in some ways, because
Exactly.
I think in in what Randy Orton does with it. I think it's his business going forward. Does with the tattoo, whether he shows it or not, whether he gets rid of it or not.
Right.
As someone with a handful of tattoos, I think it's common practice to credit the tattoo artist whenever you share that artwork, because it is their artwork. You know, yes, it's yours, and in a way you own it, but it's that person's artwork, you know, and that credit should certainly be due. And I think in the contractual process of getting a tattoo, you know, you sign paperwork and there's all of these stipulations. I think when tattooing someone with relative amount of fame, you know, maybe that contract is renegotiated, and especially after an event like this, to use it as a point of reference, you know, because I can see his I can just see how this, it's tricky, because I think it belongs to both of them. I really do.
Yeah, but it's a question of who has the right to do what with that tattoo, right? Because I don't think many people would argue that it wouldn't be okay for the tattoo artist to come after you and say, no, I'm forcing you to get surgery to remove this tattoo from your body. But I also think that many people are like, well, Randy Orton's probably making a decent chunk of change off of this tattoo art, and especially when you start to add in the sleeve, that becomes even more apparent. And I think many people will be like, oh, well, Christina Alexander deserves something for that because it's a very distinctive feature. But where does that lie, and where does it need to be set in stone? Or is this more of a conversation that Christina Alexander needs to be having with Randy Orton and not the video game company?
I think the tattoos itself is just an extremely big gray area, just because it does involve literally someone's body, right? But if we think about celebrities who wear luxury designer brands, they're giving that brand free advertising, right? So usually the brand will give them those things for free. I think this is obviously a little different because it's not like her name is plastered all over his arm.
Right. No one's been asking who he's wearing.
Right. But in the same time, it's I think a lot about well, this person, I think he got tattoos not just for a personal choice, but to establish a brand, right? And that's why you're gonna have people who wear I think Billie Eilish comes to my head first. I think she wears a lot of Gucci and stuff like that. That was designed for her by them. But it's still a part of establishing her own brand that she is in some way capitalizing off of, right? And I think that also bringing it to theater is a really interesting point as well, because I don't know. I mean, specifically with costumes, I've worked on productions that have gotten cease and desist letters from luxury brands saying you kind of recreated, this sort of looks like something from our line and we didn't give you permission to do that. Right. So you have to take it off, or something that was from that brand, bought from that brand, and they're you can't use that. So That's
interesting.
I mean, I think it just, some of those might be a little bit more freak accidents, where it's someone who happens to work at Chanel just happened to be at the show and just happened to be that's ours, and then told somebody, and then somebody, I was what's this regional theater going to do? They're not going to make a lot of money off of this one character wearing this shirt. But yeah, it just brings up good points. So it's advertising, who's benefiting off of it. I think in this specific case with this article, the reproduction of the tattoo sleeve, I think tattoo sleeves in general just shouldn't be done, because I think in terms of what the tattoos mean to those people and to what cultures, it's always just going to create some sort of controversy with someone. And yeah, but again, his uniform is his body, and then it looks like this tiny little Speedo, and then some knee pads, and then his tattoos, right? So in a way, is it okay that it's being recreated in the video game? Because would it be weirder if he didn't have it,
In my mind, the question becomes, in which way is it being recreated? Is it just being recreated because it's on his body as he's his character in the game? In that case, it seems perfectly all right. But if it's being pulled out for his title page and things, and used as themes when you're choosing Randy Orton or whatnot, I think there's a level where and this artist should certainly be compensated. If it's that big of a what am I trying to say? A presence of his character, it certainly should have been negotiated beforehand, and that artist should have had a stake in whatever profits come from those tattoos, I think.
Right. It really, I think it brings more to light that this is something that we need to actively now think about if somebody's getting a tattoo, especially if they're in the public light, is okay, this is something that we need to have a discussion about, because this just gets muddled. Again, the article hints at LeBron James in NBA 2K, and who faced a very similar lawsuit. And again, it's like, if you had Randy Orton on that video game without those tattoos, would you know that it's Randy Orton? Or like, could you just kind of put a very vague tattoo, and would that suffice? Or would people still be upset? Where does that line
even
drop?
that's discrediting the artist, is doing a different tattoo.
Right, exactly. So it's a conversation I think that needs to be happening. And again, as somebody that doesn't have tattoos, I've never been through the release forums and the papers for that. I have another article from Vice about the LeBron James situation pulled up now, and it is just very muddled. It's very murky,
Right.
and
There's never been a clear ruling about what the copyright ruling of a tattoo is, huh?
exactly.
I guess it's sort of like reality TV, right? Where like everyone you see on screen has signed a release, and if they haven't, their face is blurred. Just
Right.
like these two big blurred like arms, like wrestling or something.
Right. It's like how when you go to like sports events, like on there's a binding agreement on the ticket that like you are agreeing that you may be filmed and shown on screen, even though many people don't realize that that's a contractual agreement that they've entered into by going to a sporting event.
Yeah. I think this, in some ways, I think this brings us full circle, because it reminds me of the process that the actors in Hamilton went through to get percentages of the future gross of Hamilton. They said, we're part of the success of this thing. You're going to model future casts on both our performances and our looks, and we deserve a slice of that pie, right?
Right.
And I think that I am broadly in favor of more of the quote unquote little people getting more slices of the pie.
Exactly. Talk about streaming world in the streaming world too. Like, like when you look at like Hamilton being performed on and broadcast on Disney, like who gets that money, and whose labor goes into that, and who should deserve some of the royalties that come out of it. And
and the cast did get compensated for that.
Yeah.
The cast that appears in that got money for it. And I think they got money for it on a scale, like ensemble got less than leads. But Leslie Odom Jr., who's been one of the people who pushed for everyone to get their money for Hamilton, who really led that fight, said, I want to make the exact same amount of money that Aaron Tveit made during Grease Live, and not a cent more, you know?
Right. Exactly.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been a very interesting week this week, I think. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This has been News from the Real World. We'll see you next week.